Hi, I'm Dr. Rick Duplantis, and you're watching It's Your Health. I want to thank you for tuning in to our show tonight, and in keeping with this season of the year, and we're actually filming on Holy Thursday of Holy Week in preparation for Easter. I wanted to cover a very important topic of the suffering and the medical issues and the suffering and crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And there's been a book written many years ago on the crucifixion. It's called Doctor at Calvary, and was written many, many years ago. I have read that book and many other articles on the crucifixion of Jesus Christ from the medical standpoint of actually the suffering that he did endure. Now, the crucifixion, crucifying a man, was invented by the Persians in the year 300 BC, and then perfected by the Romans in the year 100 BC. And it is the most painful death ever invented by man. It's where we get the term excruciating. It comes from the crucifixion. You know, it was reserved primarily for the most vicious of male criminals. And so it was a horrific form of death invented by the Persians and then perfected many hundreds of years later by the Romans in 100 BC. You know, and the physical passion of Christ began in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Christ actually sweat blood. And this is a medical problem that can occur when someone is under tremendous amount of stress. And what happens is the blood vessels and the capillaries in the sweat glands rupture, and thus the person begins to sweat blood. This term is called hematidrosis. Hematidrosis is bloody sweat. It's well documented. And St. Luke, the physician, is the only one that mentions this in the gospel. He says, "And in being in agony, he prayed no longer, and his sweat became as drops of blood, trickling down upon the ground." Although this is a very rare phenomenon that occurs, bloody sweat is well documented and can occur under great emotional stress, as I mentioned, in the kind our Lord suffered. These tiny capillaries, they break, they rupture, mixing with blood and sweat, and it produced marked weakness and possible shock as well. You know, so we come on to after the arrest of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. The soldier, he was brought before Caiaphas, and one of the soldiers had struck Jesus across the face because he remained silent when he was questioned by Caiaphas. And then the next thing that occurs in the suffering of Christ is the actually scourging, and this was done. They were stripped of their clothing. You know, for us, how many lashes and how many times Christ was struck is questionable. It's doubtful that the Romans might have made any attempt to follow the Jewish law in this matter, but the Jews had an ancient law prohibiting more than 40 lashes. You know, the Roman legionnaire would step forward with a flagellum. Now, this was a short whip consisting of several heavy leather thongs with 2 small balls of lead attached near the ends of each. This heavy whip is brought down with full force again and again across the back of Jesus' shoulders, his upper back, and his legs as well. You know, and the first step, you know, is as they started to break through the superficial skin and tearing of the skin, and then they continued to strike the body with this instrument, caused tearing of the muscles and the tissues and a great deal of bleeding. So Christ lost a great deal of blood in this process. It nearly killed him. He nearly died from the scourging itself. He was chained to a pillar. His back was in a taut position, his hands above him, and he was beat from his back all the way down to his legs, and causing a tremendous amount of blood to be lost in this process. The underlying muscles were torn, and the skin on the back of Christ was hanging in long ribbons, and his entire area is an unrecognizable mass of torn, bleeding tissue when this process is finished. And, you know, it's usually determined by the centurion in charge that if the prisoner is near death, the beating should be stopped. And then with Christ half fainting, then he's untied and allowed to slump to the stone pavement, bleeding from these very, very horrific wounds. The soldiers also, the next phase was the crowning of the thorns. They took a flexible branch of long thorns, commonly used in bundles for firewood, and they were plaited together in the shape of a crown, and this was pressed to his scalp. Now we talk about the scalp in man, that we have a very vascular, it's a very, very vascular area. And, anytime you have a wound to the scalp, it can cause a great deal of bleeding because it's such a very rich vascular area of the body. And so if you can imagine these 12 different thorns piercing the scalp into the actual cranial bone of the skull, causing a great deal of bleeding, that Christ lost a great deal more blood with the crown of thorns being placed on his head. Again, copious bleeding, from this very vascular part of the body. And finally, after they tired the sadistic sport of putting a reed in his hand and putting a cloak on him and putting the thorns on his head, they tear the robe that they placed on his back completely off of him, reopening the clotted blood that occurred, reopening all these wounds, tearing and causing the bleeding to start anew again. And there again, he lost a great deal of blood. Now, from 6 o'clock to the time that the crucifixion took place, a span of 15 hours, Christ had nothing to eat or drink. And he lost a great quantity of blood. So he must have been tremendously thirsty. You get hypovolemia, loss of body fluids, from this process of this great quantity of loss of blood. Probably infection, not to mention tremendous headache from the fever of infection, from these thorns that were placed in his scalp, all the various wounds that he endured on his back, his legs, and even the thorns in the scalp itself, as we see from this picture depicting here, which is an excellent picture of the scourging of Christ. We come now to the crucifixion. And, it's about 650 yards from where he started out at to reach Golgotha, where Christ was crucified. Now, the cross consists of a stipes, which is the upright part of the cross, and that's usually fixed in the ground at the place of crucifixion. And then a crossbar, which is called the patibulum. This is carried by the condemned, and it's strapped across their back, and their arms are strapped and tied to this patibulum bar. Now, this piece of wood, this crossbar, weighs about 110 pounds. And the condemned is tied to it, and they're meant to walk the route to the area where they're going to be crucified at. There's a sign that's carried in front of them with, the title of why they're being condemned, the crime they committed. And this is to be nailed upon that cross on the condemned man. The walk from Antonia to Golgotha, like I said, it's a 650-yard journey. The loss of this amount of blood, the muscles being pushed beyond their endurance failed, and Christ has stumbled with his patibulum, this crossbar, and he's unable to catch himself because his arms are tied to it. He cannot break his fall. Thus his hands tied to this crossbar. He falls on his chest, and he cannot get up by himself. He has to be lifted up. This is 110 pounds of wood across his back, and you can imagine someone who has been under such torture and torment from the painful scourging and all the wounds from that he's very weak. He has had nothing to drink or eat. And, the crucifixion was the most painful death ever invented. It guaranteed, the crucifixion just guaranteed a horrific, slow, very painful death. And Jesus was offered wine mixed with myrrh as a mild analgesic mixture before this journey started, but he refuses to take this. Now, Simon is ordered to place the patabolum on the ground, and Jesus is quickly thrown backward with his shoulders against the wood. And one of the legionnaires, the Roman soldiers, they come to Christ. He's laid on his back, and they feel the depression in the wrist. And, many of the pictures that we see, the nail is driven to the palm of the hand, and all the artwork that we see. And it actually was driven between the two bones of the wrist, the radius and the ulnar. And when the nail was driven into this area, that would be strong enough to hold the weight of the body. You have to understand, that if it was in the palm of the hand, it would have ripped the flesh, and it would not have held the weight of the human body. But when nailed through the wrist, the radius and the ulnar, piercing the median nerve that lies in that area, causes horrific pain. And so, this was another source of great suffering, loss of blood. And also then nailing of the feet as well. When the person was nailed to a cross and then elevated and the body was lifted in, we're thinking that, this crossbar was notched where it was placed on top of the stipes, this upright piece of wood that was in the ground, fixed in the ground already. And then it was set into place. And for an individual to breathe under that circumstance, it took great pain. It was very excruciating, and the knees were flexed at about a 45-degree angle, and they were forced to bear their weight on the muscles of their thigh, which is an anatomical position that's not possible to maintain over a long period of time because it causes severe cramping, as you can see from this picture here of the feet. And, every time the body rises to take a deep breath, the individual would have to bear down pressure on the nails and then on the hand, pulling up with the hands. And it was excruciating pain, very excruciating. The crucified victim was physiologically forced to move up and down on the cross a distance of about 12 inches in order to breathe. This process of respiration caused, like I said, excruciating pain with the absolute terror of asphyxiation, of actually smothering to death. And as the 6 hours of the crucifixion wore on, Jesus was less and less able to bear his weight on his legs as his thigh and calf muscles became increasingly exhausted. There was increasing dislocation of the wrists, elbows, and shoulders, and further elevation of his chest, making his breathing much more difficult as a result. And there was shortness of breath in this position. Throughout all of this, Christ was completely naked. The leaders of the Jews crowd, the thieves on both sides, were jeering and swearing. Because Jesus could not maintain this adequate ventilation of his lungs, it was difficult to breathe in this position. He was in a state of what we call hypoventilation, and which is inadequate ventilation. He had a rise in his carbon dioxide level, and this would stimulate the heart to beat faster in order to increase the delivery of oxygen and removal of the CO2. Jesus' physiological reflexes demanded that he took deeper breaths, and he involuntarily moved up and down the cross much faster despite even this excruciating pain. However, due to the nailing of Jesus to the cross and his increasing exhaustion, he was unable to provide the oxygen that his body needed. The twin forces of hypoxia, too little oxygen, and too much CO2 causes his heart to beat faster into what we call tachycardia, rapid heart rate. And it's estimated Christ's heart rate must have been about 220 beats per minute, which is the maximum normally sustainable. Jesus had nothing to drink for 15 hours since 6 p.m. the previous evening. He endured a scourging which nearly killed him. He was already very dehydrated, and his blood pressure fell alarmingly. And his blood pressure, after going through all this blood loss and hypovolemic situation, probably had a blood pressure of 80/50. He was in first-degree shock with hypovolemia, low blood volume. He had tachycardia, excessive heart rate, tachypnea, which is a very rapid respiratory rate, and hyperhidrosis, which is we call excessive sweating. And all of these things cause, this suffering to be that much more severe because of this increasing demands of the heart. The advanced state of the hemopericardium is where, you get blood and serum in the pericardial sac. And it's thought that the heart of Christ either ruptured under this condition, and that's what was the cause of death. And Christ died at 3 o'clock on Good Friday. And it's believed that when he cried out, "It is finished," then he died. That he died from hypovolemic shock, exhaustion, and asphyxiation, inability to breathe. And this is from the various hypotheses, from the dehydration, the probable cardiac rupture of the heart of Christ, the pleural and pericardial effusions that occurred, then the fatal spear wound to the heart. That spear was thrown to the chest. It could have pierced his pulmonary artery, could have pierced the aorta and the heart muscle itself. And any type of wound like this, even if you had a complete trauma team on the scene of someone that had suffered this type of torture, it would be very unlikely that that person's life could be saved. So from the aspect of the trauma, the major factor, traumatic shock, has been complemented by the trauma induced by coagulopathy of the blood, would probably be a contributing factor in the primary mechanism. And so to bring into perspective, just how severe the suffering was that Christ underwent from a medical standpoint, with kidney failure, with the end result of heart failure as a result of the trauma to his body, a loss of a tremendous amount of blood, his heart's inability to maintain adequate perfusion of all the vital organs and the metabolic demands of the body, brought him to a very, very agonizing death over a period of 6 hours of suffering this way. And it was meant to be a very, very long agonizing death with long suffering. And that it was because of all the factors here that we just mentioned. The fact that he suffered these very fatal wounds repeatedly, lost a tremendous quantity of blood, and then without nourishment or fluid replacement, caused him to be excessively thirst and caused much of the demise of his physiological body itself. Now, Christ allowed himself to undergo this for us. Christ, the God-man, could have survived this, but no human being at all could have lived through such torture. No normal human being. And Christ chose to be as man and gave up, although divine, he chose to be as man and to suffer as man and to submit himself to the confines of a human body and suffer this physiological trauma and go through this agony, feel this pain, and actually die in this manner for us. It's impacted my life specifically in a very tremendous way. I'm sure it has impacted the lives of everyone, all Christians as well, that have read the story of the Passion of Christ, who have seen many of the movies depicting the crucifixion of Christ as well. And I just want to call to mind these medical issues that Christ bore in his human body and allowed himself to endure for mankind. And I hope that you've gained maybe a little bit more of a detailed understanding of what Jesus Christ actually went through from a physical standpoint, from a medical standpoint, the various medical issues of his inability to breathe, his suffocation, his hemorrhaging and bleeding to death, hypovolemia, all this culminating into a very horrific, painful death of the crucifixion which led to his death after 6 hours of enduring this type of torture. I want to thank you for tuning in to this very special issue today and topic on the medical issues and the suffering and crucifixion of Jesus Christ. I think it's a topic that people would appreciate and maybe have a greater understanding of the suffering and the details of the suffering of Jesus Christ that he suffered for us. And in keeping with Holy Week, I thought this would be apropos to give this presentation tonight. I hope you had a great Easter. I hope you have a pleasant evening tonight. God bless you and good night. I'm Dr. Rick Duplantis.